Okay, so here we are now at our final lecture, and today, initially this was meant to be broken up into two lectures. We're going to kind of move a little bit quick, but I think we'll still be okay. There was still some kind of built-in wiggle room there. So I think, given kind of the pace of the last lecture, it'll still be just fine with that. So. This time we're going to be talking about German Pietism and American Revivalism, and these two are actually pretty well linked, so it's going to make sense. And then kind of see some of the connections, hopefully, between some of what's going on here and what we get today with modern day evangelicalism, including in a lot of Baptist churches and that kind of thing, but also connections to some of the political goings on that are happening there between both the Enlightenment and this Pietist and then later revivalist movement as well. So um, to kind of step back just a little bit to the formation of Pietism. So back in the 17th century, beginning of the Enlightenment, around the same period of time, you have a few different things going on. So um, there is this kind of growing sense of dissatisfaction among a lot of the different Protestant groups that they are fighting over a lot of as a lot of you'll see it as dogmatic minutia. So think in particular the big disagreement between Zwingli and Luther. This is one that is still ongoing between how to understand the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. Is this meant primarily as a memorial? Is the presence of Christ, to go with the consubstantiation of Luther? Is it in with under all those different kind of things without the actual substance of the bread and wine changing, and like what does this distinction even matter? And there's always this kind of movement within a lot of these different groups of after a bunch of disagreements, well, can't we just all come along and get along? This happens in a lot of different, mostly Protestant denominations, from time to time, where there's lots of arguments and disagreements, and there's can't we all just come along? This was in large part how early Baptists formed. Certainly during depending on which side you are on, conservative resurgence or fundamentalist takeover in Southern Baptist life. This was something that was rejected, the idea of just coming along and forgetting all this. So that's kind of part of what's going on. There's this dissatisfaction over that, and believing that focusing too much on these kind of critical minutia of the doctrine is losing the point. And that leads kind of to the second point that's kind of lurking in the background here. There's a growing sense among Protestants that Christian life should be about more than just having the right doctrine. It should be more than just confessionalist. So this in particular leads to its rejection by most Lutherans even today. So sometimes you'll see it referred to as Lutheran Pietism. It does start in the Lutheran Church, but it definitely doesn't stay in the Lutheran Church. I do think German Pietism probably gets a little bit better at it, but with that said, let's kind of look to some of the forerunners to it. So you kind of have two main figures early on. I have put their dates up there, but Johann Tauler, who is this medieval mystic. So we talked a little bit about mysticism at the very, very beginning of the semester. Tauler is one of those mystics in the Germanic tradition. So this idea that you have a mystic encounter and starting to emphasize this more than church tradition, more than scripture, not to the neglect of those things, just more than had previously been done. And so this is kind of still being widely read in Germany at the time. A little bit closer to the start of Pietism, more formally, you have Johann Arndt, and he kind of went through his own, as he called it, his own conversion of sorts. He felt, in large part due to his own preaching. I mean, today we'd probably call it burnout, but that term, of course, didn't exist during the time. So he felt that he was really losing a lot of the feeling and experience with it. So he tries to rediscover his passion. In 1606, he writes a book called True Christianity, which the implication of it being true Christianity is that there must be something out there that is false Christianity. So that's part of what's going on there, is that Arndt writes this book and begins to focus, instead of just on this more academic sense, but just getting it's not about getting reading of it right. Instead, it's more about feeling and kind of cultivating that sense of fire or urgency or desire for it. And so one of the kind of direct followers of that is Philipp Jakob Spener. And Spener, I don't have his dates up there. I think it's 1635 to 1705. So he was very familiar with these works by these two people, Tauler and Arndt. And so Spener, he reads these. He actually visits around Europe pretty widely among different Protestant groups. He spends some time in Geneva. He visits another part of Switzerland where the Waldensians were pretty big. He visits with some Anabaptist groups and different things like that. So he kind of moves around in different areas and talks to these different groups, which is really unique for someone who's in that kind of German Lutheran tradition of the time, because usually they would not, intermingle with these other Reformed groups, other Protestant groups. They would think that they were mistaken or something to that effect. So he does go around, talk to these other groups, and then in 1675, he writes Pia Desideria, which just translates to pious desires or pious experiences or emotions, and different things like that. And this is what really starts Pietism more formally. Some of the characteristics of Pietism is that there's a de-emphasis on confession, and by that we mean like doctrinal purity. It's not just about mental assent, and there's a heavier emphasis on feeling. Now, part of the issue here with Spener and a lot of Pietism is that many believe that they were driving kind of a false distinction between the two, that they were separating, you might say, the intellectual and the emotional a little bit too much. They're drawing too hard of a distinction between the head and the heart. And that someone like Luther definitely is wary of the dangers of putting too much emphasis on emotionalism. In fact, that was probably one of his main issues with a lot of this medieval mysticism and that kind of thing. But he's not going to say that there is no emotion behind it. Clearly there is. So, but for Spener, at least as he understood it, there was too much emphasis on this kind of idea of doctrinal purity, of just confessing to the right thing and just believing the right things in the right way. And there wasn't enough emphasis on the desires or the experience or the feeling of it. So that was kind of the first part of that. Secondly, he wants to talk about he tends to be, or Pietism in general, tends to be fairly anti-institutional. It's not about this church where you have a pastor over it and they give all the doctrines. Instead, it's more about having, oftentimes referred to as a church within a church, the truly committed. And you can see this aspect is still very, very prevalent today in a lot of different areas. We're going to talk very briefly about how that kind of comes out of the Pietist movement. But this idea of having small groups, that this is where the real work of the church gets done, that we have these individual pockets that are part of the bigger church, but really that bigger church, there's a lot of people that aren't doing anything. And so the real church is what the laity are doing, and how they're doing it, and they're working in these smaller, more intimate setting groups. And that's where the real Bible study happens. That's where the real social action happens. And so these are the things that we need to focus on. That's a big point of Pietism. The hermeneutics is now based more upon personal feeling and impression, instead of on like academic study. So instead of approaching the Bible or approaching Scripture and trying to find the objective, correct way to interpret this, instead of looking at the languages to try to determine the author's meaning and that kind of thing. Instead, you have this rise of the idea of you read Scripture and then you just kind of say what it means to you. And this is, in many ways, how a lot of these small group Bible study is still done today. People get around, they read a passage of Scripture, and then they kind of go, okay, well, all right, John, what do you think that says? Or what does that say to you? And people kind of give their own personal interpretation based upon nothing, really. And so this kind of movement starts with Pietism. So you have that. Probably the biggest kind of ongoing effort or outcropping of this is a heavier emphasis upon personal Bible study. The idea of a quiet time where you are reading the Bible on your own is completely foreign up to this point. This was more of a monastic thing where different people have access to the one biblical text. A lot of this has to do with just questions of literacy and accessibility. Prior to Gutenberg's press, it was just too expensive. Like printing presses existed, but you didn't have the movable type of the printing press. That's what you get with Gutenberg, is that you can very quickly reset the type, create new ones, and that led to much lower printing costs. More people could afford to own a Bible because books were now much more ubiquitous. It kind of takes a little while for them to get to this level of ubiquity, but once that starts to happen, then you have literacy starts to go way, way up. And so as more people are able to read, they have access to read the Bible, they may have their own personal copy, or at least a family copy, then they start reading the Bible on their own. And you have this individual time that you are having just you and God and the Bible kind of thing. And so that's kind of still an enduring kind of outcropping of this Pietism movement. That idea of small group Bible study, of personal interpretation, and a personal individual one-on-one Bible study, or a quiet time, you might say today. So those were some of the outcroppings. Another one is this kind of new idea behind what justification is. And this is really the primary reason that it's rejected by German Lutherans of the time. So the German Evangelical Church, or the Lutheran Church, rejects it primarily for this idea, that Spener says pretty explicitly that justification is not by faith alone, it's by faith and sanctification is through pious acts. So to talk about sanctification in these terms, as that you do justification, so that justification, and to be very clear, it is faith alone by which you're justified. Even the most ardent pietist is going to say that. But this idea that sanctification is not also something that is just imparted upon you, it's not something that just transforms external to you, that somehow you do something to bring about your own sanctification, that you have to do these different pious acts to do that. That is the kind of radical divide that happens, and why Lutheranism ends up rejecting it outright. So that's kind of the big sticking point. And then finally, theological training, things like seminary, that sort of thing. That for Pietism, they believe it should, or Pietists, they believe it should really focus on spiritual formation, focus on the practical life, the how-to, the business end, but not on scholarly study of the Bible. That you don't really need this, like courses like this one on church history and theology. You don't really need stuff on like Greek and Hebrew. You don't need things on biblical interpretation. All you need to do is just read the Bible. You have the Holy Spirit. It'll help you interpret it. That's all that you really need at the end of the day. And so when you you do need seminary, but it's primarily there for spiritual formation, to help you kind of cultivate your aptitude to listen to the Spirit, and the practicalities of life. And that's how Pietism does. Now, seminaries have kind of taken some of the aspects of this, the idea that we should have spiritual formation, because you'll find some seminaries that don't. And if you go back a few years, most seminaries, I say a few years, we're talking several years, most seminaries would not have much in the way of spiritual formation at all. Nowadays, most seminaries have at least a few courses in spiritual formation that are required for at least the primary pastoral certification, the MDiv. There's a little bit more about the practicalities of life. It's not just an academic scholarly degree. So you kind of have that coming off as well. So you can kind of see here through a lot of these different aspects the enduring influence of Pietism. Especially, I mean, this is how a lot of churches are done now. That you do have like a Sunday morning Bible study, or you have a life group in a home, or you have an emphasis on like your own personal reading of the Bible. These are things that all come out of Pietism. You don't really see them, at least not widespread, before this point. Now, Pietism, most Pietist churches try to remain within Lutheranism. Most Lutherans are not accepting of this. And it's not until later, August Hermann Francke. And Francke is really the one that kind of shifts it to make it not just a Lutheran thing anymore. And it kind of pushes it out to this much broader sensibility. It begins to have an impact upon various different groups, the Moravians, and if you know anything about the history of John Wesley, the Moravians are particularly influential upon Wesley. So we're going to kind of shift gears to start talking about Wesley, a little bit more about the Moravians, just so you kind of know what's going on with them. Well, actually, I tell you what, we're going to hold off on that until we get to later on with Wesley. So John Wesley, born in 1703, one of 18 children, although most of his brothers and sisters did not survive into adulthood. So it sounds like a staggering number right now. I would say it was still large, but it wasn't that unusual at the time. Most famous of his brothers being Charles Wesley, he and John wrote a number of hymns together. His mother, Susanna Wesley, was a dissenter. She was very strict. She believed in a very formal education at home. They learned Greek and Latin. He does, early on, he goes to Oxford University and gets some of his first training there. He actually begins to talk about holiness during that time. You kind of have these early ideas that Christian life begins when you overcome sin. He talks in this sort of language. But he teaches at Oxford for a while, so after he graduates, he begins to teach there for a while. He's called up to be a pastor, and then he returns to Oxford. And when he returns to Oxford, at the time, his brother Charles is there. And his brother Charles has joined a group that's now known as the Oxford Holy Club. Sometimes the Holiness Club, but Oxford Holy Club. And so when John comes back, he joins this club. And this is a group of people that are doing things like fasting and praying. They're meeting daily from 6 to 9 p.m., focusing on reading the Bible. It's kind of a semi-monastic type of living. They do. There's this kind of implied understanding that none of them are going to get married, and they kind of take an implied vow of celibacy in order to focus on doing the work of God as they see it. John Wesley ends up kind of taking over and becoming the leader of this group at the urging of Charles. It's not like he stole it out from under him. But from the broader Oxford community, they're referred to as enthusiasts. And this is meant to be a derogatory term. And in fact, this is when you first have the label ascribed to them as Methodists. And it was meant to be an insult. This idea that these people think that they are going to somehow be sanctified or bring about their sanctification through their methods. And already you start seeing some of that kind of pulling in, even if they're not fully aware of it, of the Pietist movement at the time. Because they are doing different methods like fasting and praying and scriptural reading in this small group. But they more or less take that term Methodist and they wear it as a badge of honor. They eventually became known as the Methodists. So that's kind of some of the early beginnings. A number of things happen around this time. So you have a guy named James Oglethorpe, who's a parliamentarian, and he is very much into this Pietist movement that's kind of spread out away from Lutheranism as a result of Frankie and some others. And so he's involved with the Moravians a little bit, and again, we'll talk about the Moravians just here in a little bit. But James Oglethorpe, he's really concerned about a number of social issues and social justice issues and that kind of thing. And so one of those being the idea of debtor's prison. And if you remember anything from some maybe high school U.S. history class or something like that, the idea of a debtor's prison is that if someone's in debt, they will be thrown into prison until they can pay that debt. You see things like that even in the Bible. But there's a problem with that. Like, how is someone who's in jail going to pay the debt? And so you end up having this, basically making the situation worse. And so one of the things that James Oglethorpe works at really hard is to close a lot of these debtors' prisons. So he's successful in doing so. Some of them are closed, but the problem is that now you have all of these, poor people, technically convicts. No one's hiring them. Where are they all going to go? And so he's able to, work through different means. And in 1732, he founds Georgia It's not exclusively for these newly released debtors, but it's primarily that's the reason why he founds Georgia. So he founds it for these groups. Um, Oglethorpe is talking with Wesley, and Wesley kind of feels this, rising zeal that he needs to go do something. So he goes to Georgia on what amounts to a mission trip. It's unclear if he intended to stay there permanently, but at least for a length of time he meant to stay there. So while he's there, on the boat trip, and this is kind of where the Moravians show up. So on the boat trip, this is still an arduous journey. They weren't particularly good at measuring longitude, so you never knew how long it was going to be, even if you were on the boat. So it could be anywhere from just under a month to a few months to make that trip across the Atlantic Ocean. And so during a particularly bad storm, John Wesley is very worried sick. He's beginning to wonder about do I even trust God? And he notices that there's a group of Moravians. And Moravians kind of date back all the way to Jan Hus in Bohemia, and they were kind of this early church, sometimes even claimed to be the first Protestant church. But this early church, and they had been able to kind of exist and then existed more or less under the radar in Roman Catholic territory. At the beginning of the 1700s, they make their way to some land that's owned by Count Zinzendorf, and not really a better word for it, you would call it probably a revival. Happens while they are there, and they institute 24/7 prayer. The idea comes from Moravians. They are heavily influenced, and just about every historian agrees, they're heavily influenced by the Pietist movement while they're there. So they have wholeheartedly adopt Pietism, and that's kind of the background on the Moravians. Wesley sees these Moravians and is very curious about how they can be so calm in the midst of this storm. And kind of the point that they give him is like, look, we know that this is all under God's control. If it's God's desire to take us, it's our time to go. And if it's not, then it's not our time to go. But they are abnormally calm during this time. So that makes an impression on him. Anyway, he lands in Georgia. He begins working in a church. And he begins to get involved a little bit with a woman named Sophie Hopke. It seems that there's an initial attraction there, at least. They do talk about possibly getting married, but he kind of pulls back and usually says, I don't think that either of us are going to get married. In fact, he is still in this mindset of to get married is to somehow not be serious about the Christian faith. So she pretty quickly after this ends up getting married to somebody else. The problem for Wesley is that he is their pastor, both Sophie Hopke and her new husband's pastor. So because she gets married so quickly, he decides that she must not be serious, and because this guy married her, he must not be very serious about their Christian faith. And so he decides to withhold communion from them. This ends up being, causing quite a controversy. He does seem to be withholding communion because he's mad. There really isn't. He doesn't come off in a good light in this area. So this is in Savannah, Georgia. He is pretty much run out of town at this point, and so he goes back to England. He goes back to London, and while he's there, he remembers these Moravians. And August Spangenberg was their leader. He's an important figure in American Moravian churches. But he remembers these Moravians, and so he finds at Aldersgate there's this revival or weekly reading that's going on, or daily reading rather, that's going on at Aldersgate. And so he decides to go attend one of their meetings. And 24th of May, 1738, and he writes it in his diary, his journal, which is why we know that date so clearly. He attends this meeting. They're reading an introduction, Luther's introduction to his commentary on Romans, and Wesley comments that his heart is strangely warmed, and that's the terminology that he uses. It's become pretty iconic. He refers to this as his conversion, and he says that that's his conversion because that's the point at which sin no longer dominated him. So that's kind of what how he understands it, and that's what's kind of going on there with him. So that's a little bit of the background there. It's going to be helpful probably to talk about another figure who kind of comes up during the same time. You have another guy by the name of George Whitefield. Now, Whitefield, initially Whitefield and John Wesley kind of just miss each other. When Wesley leaves to go to Georgia, Whitefield shows up and actually is part of the Holy Club from Oxford. And then when Wesley comes back, Whitefield actually leaves and goes working in a variety of different areas. He kind of earns a reputation fairly early on for being this just amazing preacher. So a little bit more about the background of Whitefield. He goes to Oxford essentially on like a work-study scholarship. So he is able to go to Oxford, able to attend classes, earn his degree, but he is there working for the more wealthy students. So he serves their table, he kind of acts as their butler, sometimes he acts as their tutor and that kind of thing. So he's from these kind of more humble beginnings. But after leaving, he very quickly gains a reputation. He is kind of known for open air preaching. In fact, he preaches to coal miners, and he spends a lot of his time actually going up and down the coast in America. And so he's kind of mostly well known for this kind of big open air preaching. Several people went to go see him preach at various points in time. He ends up being one of the key figures of the Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening, and that kind of thing. But both he and Wesley become friends because they have this heavy emphasis on the idea of the new birth. Incidentally, Whitefield is so well known that Benjamin Franklin goes to hear him speak at one point. Franklin, who makes no qualms about the fact that he is a deist and definitely not a Christian, but he goes and he says that he can't describe the feeling really. There's this kind of big thing going on with it. So Whitefield, for his part, is fully Anglican. He definitely does not start in that more Swiss Reformed movement trajectory, what have you. But he very quickly kind of moves into that, largely due to the literature of the Anglican Church. 39 Articles, the Book of Common Prayer, are very Reformed doctrines. So he kind of fully jumps into that. On the flip side, around the same time this is happening with Whitefield, you have the Wesleys arguing for what they call the freedom of grace. And back in 1739, John Wesley publishes a sermon on the freedom of grace. Whitefield is in America at the time, and he is this kind of horseback preacher going up and down the coast on horseback between different areas, doing open air preaching. And he's when it's published in America, this kind of upsets Whitefield a little bit. They do have these conversations back and forth, but they're mostly in private. It reaches a little bit of a height when Whitefield is invited to the Methodist headquarters, which is known as the Foundry at the time, on Christmas Eve in 1740, and he preaches on the election and predestination doctrines. And so this is kind of fundamentally against the ideas of Wesley at the time. We're going to get to Wesley's doctrine here in just a second. And Wesley's group was known as the United Societies. Whitefield's group, where their main headquarters was down the street, known as the Tabernacle. They're known as Calvinist Methodist. Eventually they become the Presbyterian Church of Wales. If you know anything about Martin Lloyd-Jones, kind of famous preacher, he's in that same tradition as well. So they have a lot of disagreements, the Wesley brothers. So John Wesley is the more of the theologian preacher, but he and his brother together write a lot of hymns that kind of also give forth a lot of the same theology. So Wesley's theology is one that's a little bit more different and unique, so we're going to talk about his theology a little bit. The kind of positive about all of this is even though they disagree very sharply, they maintain their friendship, Wesley and Whitefield do. throughout their lives they maintain their friendship. And Whitefield dies in 1770, and it's John Wesley who preaches at his funeral. So they have this, very robust, joyful kind of friendship that exists between the two of them. But Wesley is definitely in what might be called the more Arminian stance. In 1765, Wesley does write what he calls a short history of Methodism, and this is again while Whitefield is in America. And Wesley kind of suggests that it's Whitefield who first brings up the issue. So there's still a little bit of animosity there, but they're pretty congenial. In fact, the statement that Wesley comments about it is, with respect to their friendship between Wesley and Whitefield, that they will stick to the grammar of faith and repentance, not the university of predestination and reprobation. So the idea of these kind of basic things of what they're calling the new birth at this point, and again you can kind of hear the overtones of the Pietist movement there, that these are the things that they can agree on. Whenever they talk about, they're going to talk about these things. Faith and repentance, how that kind of idea of salvation is the way that they're going to talk about that. So whereas he views these other issues, these more things like Calvinism, that sort of thing, these are much bigger issues. They're not unimportant, but they're definitely not things that we should disagree to the point of not being friends anymore. So Wesley's theology. What is Wesley's theology? So he is definitely Arminian in his theology. Wesley is really the one that develops this idea of prevenient grace. He is going to say that yes, man is corrupt, humanity's will is fundamentally corrupt, but God issues a kind of a separate sort of grace. This is not saving grace. This is what he calls prevenient grace, grace before the fact. And this grace gives people freedom and basically saves their will. It doesn't fully restore it, but it helps it overcome its corruption and allows people to choose. So that's kind of how he understands prevenient grace. He also talks a lot about this idea of conversion, and that he converted in 1738, which is odd because he had been a minister for a while, he had been part of this holy club for a while. So what is he talking about there? What he's really talking about is that it was at this point that he experienced, as he calls it, Christian perfection. Now, Christian perfection does not mean that Christians can be perfect. He's not a full 100% Pelagian as far as this is concerned. Instead, Christian perfection for Wesley is what he sometimes refers to as a second work of grace. And if you know anything about a lot of the groups that come out with what's known as the holiness tradition or Wesleyan holiness tradition, a lot of times they'll talk about a second work of grace or a second baptism or a baptism in the Spirit or Pentecost or the impartation of the spiritual gifts or different things like that. That's where this comes from, this idea of this is what Christian perfection is. Like, yes, you've already had your justifying incident where you're justified by faith alone. That's already happened, but then you have a second incident that happens that moves you towards Christian perfection. And the idea is this is not you're perfect now, but that you are on the route to perfection. This perfection is more teleological. It's at the end is where that perfection is going to happen. And so you are on that route, you are making stuff better, that you have these moments at least where you are able to overcome your sin nature. So that you're able to live in the Spirit, live by the Spirit, overcome your narcissism, even if it's only these temporary moments that pop up. And in those moments of Christian perfection, you can say that you are perfect in that kind of broader sense of like you are being made perfect. It's kind of how Wesley understands that terminology. The kind of main reason why there's this big disagreement with Wesley and those who are maybe Presbyterian or someone like Whitefield is that for someone like Wesley, he thinks that the imputation of Christ's righteousness leads to the impartation of Christ's righteousness through sanctification. So another way to put that is that justification opens the door for sanctification. So as concerns your salvation, your justification, he is full-hearted, 100% in the Protestant camp. As it concerns your sanctification, though, then you might begin to say that, well, this is almost, if not entirely, semi-Pelagian. That there is a kind of cooperation with God that goes in. That God is doing a work, but you also are doing a work. And this is kind of how Wesley understands what the process of sanctification is. That justification is that first step, and that sanctification is this broader kind of trajectory of your life. That is not the Lutheran view, and that's not the Reformed view. The Lutheran and the Reformed view is that sanctification is also wholly and entirely the work of God upon you. So that you have justification is by faith alone, through Christ alone, that He's the one who's doing it. So also sanctification is by faith alone, through Christ alone, that He's the one who's doing it. It's not to say that there aren't good works and that there aren't experiences, but it's nothing that you are doing. It's totally done upon you. And this is where Wesley takes it in that different direction and leans in that more Arminian direction. That no, like you have to do these things, and these things are working with God toward your sanctification. But it's not like you can be sanctified without being justified first. So you have to have that justification first. That's wholly by faith, but he does believe that you have a choice to make as part of that. And then after that justification, you have this sanctification, which is this cooperation between you and God that's happening. So that, kind of in a nutshell, is Wesley's theology. Moving a little bit back to Whitefield. So Whitefield is mostly known for his work during what's known as the First Great Awakening. The other big figure that kind of dominates that is Jonathan Edwards. So Jonathan Edwards, he lived 1703-1758. Actually died, fairly young, even for the time, fairly young. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But he was, depending on how you count it, either the first or second generation of those who were born on, U.S. soil to British colonists. So that's kind of where he's coming from. So kind of very early on, he didn't immigrate over; he was born in America, and he was something of a prodigy at the age of 11. He published in what amounts to now we would call it like a peer-reviewed journal on the natural world. This was a dialogue about spiders, which if you read the reading from Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, he has a lot of talk about spiders and that kind of thing. So this is something that started earlier. At the age of 13, he goes to Yale, and it's here that he begins to have a lot of the Enlightenment influence upon him. This idea of the tabula rasa and that kind of thing, that your experience impacts who you are. He's not going to buy into this idea that everyone's born as a blank slate, but he does accept and like the idea that your experience has a fundamental part of shaping you. So in 1727, he goes and becomes what's known as a pastor scholar at his grandfather's church. His grandfather Solomon Stoddard. And it's during this time he also meets his wife Sarah. And Sarah Edwards, if you really like the history, Jonathan Edwards comes off as actually a pretty stand-up guy and all this. And the writings back and forth between Sarah and Jonathan kind of show that they had this deep and abiding kind of marriage love that just kind of grows throughout their lives. So you have that going on. Around the same period, though, you begin to have also what's known as the First Great Awakening. So shortly after he arrives there, these first kind of open-air revival preaching starts to happen. So most of the open-air stuff is done primarily by George Whitefield. There's a few others who try to imitate him. But Edwards kind of makes a name for himself as being a preacher occasionally at this church in outside Boston. I say occasionally, that wasn't his primary job. As the pastor scholar, he's mostly there as a resource to the pastor. And just a little bit more about Solomon, his grandfather. So it kind of gives you an idea of what's going on during this Great Awakening period. So his grandfather had this idea, because there were a lot of people in the churches during that time. So you have to understand some of what's going on during the time there. There were a lot of people that became very wealthy as a result of coming to America. Slavery was starting to take hold, and so that led to a lot of leisure time to the kind of British white people of the time frame. And so this was viewed pretty negatively. So Wesley in particular, and Methodism has long kind of has this history of opposing slavery, at least from the Wesleyan end and the Northern Methodist groups. Um, but you had this issue where, because of the influence of Pietism up to this point, there's an idea that you have to have some kind of radical conversion and be able to give a conversion event. Before Pietism, you don't have this big emphasis on a conversion event, but after Pietism, in some of these churches, and these are definitely the churches that are influential upon Edwards, upon Whitefield, upon Wesley, that you have to be able to basically give an account of your conversion. And it's like, say when that happened. This is the same idea that persists in a lot of American churches today, that you have to be able to you write down the date of when that happened. And so there's this issue in a lot of churches that you have a lot of people that they don't have a specific date they can write down, but you also have a lot of people who, they're not really they don't look like they're Christian from the way that they're living. They kind of have this more lazy style of Christianity. And so the result is that you have people who are part of the church, but 90% of the members of the church are not actually members, meaning that they are not able to receive the Lord's Supper. They're not able to have their children baptized. And so one of the big things that Solomon Stoddard does is he introduces this idea of a halfway covenant. It's kind of the way that he refers to it. So this halfway covenant basically says, okay, you can't come up with a specific day and time when you made your conversion happen. Okay, but can you at least sign on to some of these doctrines in a very generic sense? Can you at least give us that? If you can, then we'll allow you to take the Lord's Supper, and we'll allow you to baptize your kids. Now, this is probably one of the most controversial things that his father did. And this is something that his grandfather did. It's something that Jonathan Edwards disagreed with him heavily. Eventually, it does lead to Edwards being forced out. But for Stoddard, he views the Lord's Supper as a converting ordinance. The idea that by taking the Lord's Supper, they are going to be converted to it, which is a very different understanding of the Lord's Supper. Because up to this time, everyone, Protestant, Catholic, everyone, you had to already be a member of the church to receive it. Even if you were a member of that church, you had to be part of the global church in order to receive communion or the Lord's Supper. With someone like Stoddard, though, he starts arguing, no, by allowing them to take it, maybe they will be converted. So that's kind of the thing that he starts. So there's all this going on. You have a lot of people who they understand the scriptures. They understand a lot of these doctrines that when you read something like sinners in the hands of an angry God, it seems kind of odd. But the people of the time would have understood this. And what Edwards is able to do is make it more real and connect it more directly to their lives. And that's why you have stories of people thought that they were worried that the floor was going to open up and swallow them while Edwards was preaching that sort of thing going on. Someone like Whitefield, a very kind of strong, Calvinist message, but he's got this great speaking voice, and there's this fervor that kind of goes around them, and that's really what the Great Awakening is about. For his part, Edwards was not a big fan of the kind of ecstatic aspect of that. He does have a work on what he calls religious affections, and he does talk a little bit about the place of emotion within all of this, but he doesn't really like the extreme fervor of it, and that kind of thing. So this is what's going on with the Great Awakening. Some of the things that are also pioneered out of this is Whitefield is the one who introduces really what amounts to an invitation, that he ends each of his sermons kind of basically opening the door for anyone who wants to come and be part of that. Whereas Edwards, for his part, really wants to de-emphasize this kind of extreme, miraculous type, ecstatic experience of God. Instead, for Edwards, despite the kind of reputation around him, he really wants to talk about the God of the ordinary, the God of the everyday, that God is in everything. This is, in part, very much counter to deism, which is the idea that God just winds up the universe and lets it go and then doesn't involve himself. Edwards wants to say that no, God is intimately involved with every detail of the universe, which is a very, that very Swiss Reformed, Calvinist Reformed way of thinking, that God is intimately involved in every single aspect of it, that he is constantly upholding it, preventing it from just completely falling apart. And this is Edward's understanding of it, and really to a large extent, probably Whitfield's as well. So these are the different things that are going on. Once you have these revivals happening, they become less concerned with the different churches. So you do have a lot of different churches going around. There's some that are Moravian, some that are Lutheran, some that are more Wesleyan leaning, some that are this more Anglican kind of Swiss Reformed traditional, Anglican that are more the Armenian group. You also have the Baptist groups that are coming out of this, Quakers that are coming around the same time. All these different groups, but they all kind of come to these big outdoor area meeting groups. And this is where you get the idea of revivalism, that all of these different churches, no matter what they believe, they're going to come together to hear this one person speak about revival. And this is really the unique thing that comes out of this. And this is where there were revivals beforehand, but the emphasis on revival and as this big emotional, ecstatic experience, and that you're going somewhere that's not in the church. You're going out into the field or into, today, a football stadium or that kind of thing. Like Billy Graham is really a strong parallel to someone like George Whitfield, which is why you have this strong connection within modern day evangelicalism to this First Great Awakening. So that's a big part of what's going on there. This, in a lot of ways, the big revivals that were not part of a church, that were just kind of open to anyone, whomever, wherever, irrespective of who they were, kind of out in the open, this leads to a much more populist understanding of religion. And that populist understanding of religion definitely feeds into what would eventually lead up to the American Revolution. And there's a lot of other factors that lead up into that as well. But one of them is that idea that you don't have to be of noble birth, that it is a kind of religion of, for, and by the people, as it were. So this is a big part of what's going on with all of that. And so we have the different we have the different readings and that kind of thing. So hop onto the Canvas site, and we're gonna you're gonna have some questions there. If you have not turned anything into me, please do so, because we are kind of running toward the end of the semester. And I will see you on the Canvas site.